what I'm suggesting is that national institutions of human rights, on the rights of indigenous peoples, have a key role to play in ensuring that the various branches of government do this, take into account the various aspects of the Declaration, and operationalize those aspects of the Declaration that are pertinent to their activities in the day-to-day operations of government. And so national institutions of human rights, I think, have a promotional function to play in this regard. A promotional function in ensuring that the various institutions of government are, one, aware of the Declaration, and secondly, are operationalizing the Declaration in their day-to-day activities. Secondly, national institutions of human rights, of indigenous people's rights, should function as, I think most are intended to be a voice for indigenous peoples. Often, a major problem for indigenous peoples is simply not having access to power. Indigenous people simply are often not heard. And that, of course, is the first step to any kind of change, to any kind of development that will address indigenous people's concerns, ensuring that indigenous people's voices are heard. And many times that isn't the case. Indigenous peoples don't have access, for one reason or another, to the various institutions of government that touch upon their concerns. And what national institutions for indigenous peoples should endeavor to do is to be a voice for indigenous peoples, not just in the sense of hearing indigenous peoples in regard to their own programs, that is the programs of the national institutions, but being a conduit so that indigenous people's voices can be heard through national institutions to the other branches of government, or ensuring that indigenous peoples have access directly to, assisting indigenous peoples to have a voice directly with the various other institutions of government. And of course, national institutions should also endeavor to ensure that their own programs, their own specific programs that are aimed specifically at indigenous peoples, incorporate these new principles of human rights, these new standards of human rights that are incorporated in the Declaration, that are stated in the Declaration. It's with some concern that I've been able to hear from various national institutions on the rights of indigenous peoples, including various government agencies in my part of the world, in the Americas, and hear from them that they are unaware of these new standards that are incorporated in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These standards that have been affirmed by the United Nations General Assembly and that have been supported in many cases, or most cases, by the states that these national institutions are affiliated with or associated with. And I think it's very important that national institutions themselves become fully aware of the Declaration and the standards that it represents, this new understanding about the rights of indigenous peoples that it represents based on basic human rights principles, and incorporate that new understanding, these norms, within their own programs specifically aimed at the rights of indigenous peoples. And so these are the kind of things that I think, in summary, or in conclusion, that I think that national institutions can do in helping to implement the Declaration in this new environment that we're in after the adoption of the Declaration. First of all, ensuring that the various institutions of government are incorporating the norms in the Declaration within their day-to-day activities as they relate to indigenous peoples. Secondly, ensuring indigenous peoples have a voice with regard to the various institutions of government, facilitating that voice with regard to indigenous peoples, and finally, incorporating the principles of the Declaration with their own specific programs that are aimed at assisting indigenous peoples. What we're in, I think, is, like I've suggested, is really a new era, one that contrasts from what might be described as a colonial era in the relationship between states and indigenous peoples. When I think about the Bureau of Indian Affairs, an institution that Suhas mentioned, which is the agency of the United States government, the United States is the country I come from, that deals with indigenous issues. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was established essentially as a colonial agency. Even the U.S., even though the United States had long gained its independence from Great Britain, the Bureau of Indian Affairs operated as a colonial agency of the United States vis-a-vis indigenous peoples, in a very classic sense. What was its function? Its function was to manage the affairs of indigenous peoples on a day-to-day basis. Bureau of Affairs agents ran indigenous communities, much like the colonial agents of Great Britain ran India in the past. They actually were located on indigenous lands and the reservations, as we call them, the territories of indigenous peoples, and ran the day-to-day operations. And did so not with the objective of seeing indigenous peoples ultimately can take control of their own lives, but with the objective ultimately of indigenous peoples disappearing eventually as distinct groups, with distinct cultural groups, with the idea that they would simply either die off or become assimilated within the broader society. Very paternalistic attitude in which what was good for Native peoples was to simply educate them in the ways of the larger society, make sure that they don't pass on their cultures from one generation to the next. Why? Because those cultures weren't very good. They were inferior, deemed inferior to the culture of the dominant society. And push indigenous peoples in a direction that clearly they did not want to go, under this view of a superior non-indigenous society. The Declaration really turns away from that model and suggests that the kind of model we're in today is when indigenous peoples are able to, and not just able to, but have the right to take control of their own destinies. That this model of paternalism, this colonial model of administration, state administration towards indigenous peoples, is and should be a thing of the past. So what does that mean for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, this agency that still exists in the United States, this agency that has these colonial origins in the United States, that functioned in this way with regard to Native peoples? It means that now the Bureau of Indian Affairs should facilitate the self-determination of indigenous peoples. It doesn't mean that it should go away, but it means that it should now function to facilitate indigenous peoples' self-determination. Should incorporate indigenous peoples in the development of its programs, incorporate indigenous peoples in the execution of its programs, and eventually diminish its role in the management of the day-to-day affairs of indigenous peoples, as indigenous peoples are able to take on those functions on their own. And in the end, to the extent the Bureau of Indian Affairs has a role, it's to support indigenous peoples in the ways that I've suggested, in ensuring that the policies of the state address indigenous people's concern in their day-to-day operations, in helping indigenous peoples to gain access to power, facilitate indigenous peoples having a voice, and to ensure that in its various programs that assist indigenous people in areas of health, education, and so forth, that the various principles of self-determination are operative. The various principles that are included in the Declaration are fully operative. It's really a new era. It's an exciting one. And it's one in which we don't anymore have to argue, I think, at least at the international level, and hopefully eventually at the national level, about these basic rights, about these basic principles. I mean, the battle in many ways has been won, at least at the international level, that these principles are the correct ones. The principles that indigenous peoples have been fighting for are now essentially accepted. What needs to be done now is that they are implemented and assimilated at the domestic level, and this conference is a very important step in that direction, a very important piece of that effort to see that these principles, this new era, that represent this new era, are operationalized within the domestic context, and specifically in connection with national institutions on the rights of indigenous peoples. Thanks very much.